If the government really wants to implement its program as outlined in the campaign, it would mean reducing the size of the public service.
Carney may be laying the foundation for an NDP comeback, which could secure a Conservative victory in the next election. Here at Northern Perspective, we take no joy in seeing anyone face the threat of a job loss. But it does make you wonder if some public service voters are starting to feel a bit of buyer's remorse. Mark Carney had been writing blank checks left and right, and now the math just doesn't add up. A recent report, echoed by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, shows that to pay for all of this spending, the government would need to cut over 90,000 federal jobs. That's not a political talking point. It's a financial reality that's going to impact thousands of families. And the irony? Carney may be laying the foundation for an NDP comeback, which could secure a Conservative victory in the next election.
Let's take a look. Worst cuts in modern history. Report warns of cuts to public service for Liberals to meet campaign promise.
Quote, if the Prime Minister follows through on his election promise, Canada's federal public service will undergo the worst spending cuts in modern history, end quote, the report says. Quote, that will inevitably diminish the quality of public services, end quote. The Liberal Party platform said the party was committed to, quote, capping, not cutting public service employment, end quote. The platform promised a reduction in the use of external consultants and using artificial intelligence to enhance government productivity.
So this was a recent report that was dropped by an organization in Canada that is kind of like a policy think tank. And they've been looking over Carney's spending plan because it's not a budget. We don't have a budget yet. And the problem is when you keep dumping spending upon spending upon spending, you have to have a way to pay for it. Now, the way Carney has been talking, this is very reminiscent of Justin Trudeau's, well, the budget will balance itself rhetoric way back in 2014, 2015. Why? Because Carney seems to think that we're going to build the strongest economy in the G7. We're going to have all these projects. It's going to create all these jobs. Okay, but how are you going to pay for all of this stuff now? And there's no guarantee that there's going to be any nation building projects at all because you haven't talked about any yet.
Right. What are these nation building projects? I mean, Canadians want pipelines. I think that's clear. It will help individuals in the way that it will create jobs and it will help our economy. But Bill C-69 is still in place.
Well, and he's given provincial premiers veto power. And we've already had a veto from David Eby out in British Columbia. You know, the province that's on the west coast that is on the coast of where the biggest market is for a lot of our oil and gas, which is China and India and Eastern Asia. Yeah, that one. So if you can't build a pipeline out there, sure, you could probably build a pipeline up through the north or out to Hudson Bay.
Cold.
But yeah, like it drastically increases the travel time, which increases the cost. So this is a problem. Now, CTV recently covered this, and this is what they had to say.
Patricia, Mark Carney's campaign platform promised to save the government $13 billion every year until the year 2028, and that was said to be possible through increased government efficiency. Experts say that won't be easy, especially once you factor in Canada's defense spending, NATO commitments, which continues to beg the question, how's the Prime Minister going to get it done? So here's the situation. Carney is promising to spend 5% of Canada's GDP on defense by 2035, a pledge that will mean billions more in spending per year and the biggest increase since the Second World War. That makes these proposed cuts that much harder to accomplish. This new report from the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives suggests those savings would mostly be through layoffs, amounting to a 24% cut in government spending. The report's author says that will inevitably diminish the quality of the public service, and the pitch of mostly cutting consultants won't be enough to achieve the government's goal.
What that probably means is that D&D, which makes up over a quarter of all operating expenses, is off the table now, because you're not going to increase the budget by $9 billion this year and then cut it again 2 years from now. You're going to keep increasing it because you're trying to get not only to 2%, but probably to 5% in the end. So D&D off the table, that's a quarter of your operating expenses off the table that then has to be made up for by the rest.
McDonald adds these proposed cuts would likely hit the public service harder than those made during the Harper era, suggesting they would impact services right across the board. In the meantime, Carney's government promised $130 billion in new measures during the election campaign, including cutting the lowest marginal tax rate, balancing the government's operating budget, and again, boosting defense spending. Patricia.
All these promises, and your revenue is disappearing.
Right. We lost 7,000 the other day when...
7 billion.
Yeah, sorry, 7 billion. What am I thinking? 7,000? That would have been a walk in the park. They lost 7 billion when they scrapped the digital services tax. Now, we thought that was a bad tax to begin with, but the point is the government was counting on that money, and now they don't have it. And prior to that, it was even prior to the election where they lost about 20 billion because they got rid of all these tariffs that, Carney was talking all tough against the United States.
Well, and then they said that they weren't going to follow through with capital gains. So that's $20 billion over a couple of years that they're not going to get. And you've eliminated the carbon tax, moved it over to the industrial side. So that's probably going to be revenue neutral. And what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And they just put forward a tax cut. So that took, I think, $6 billion off the table. So you have all of this money that you're going to spend. Where is it coming from, Mr. Banker?
Right, and you can't run a deficit forever.
And this is why all of the opposition parties, not just the Conservatives, have been saying, where's your freaking budget?
And Canadians should be asking this question of their elected officials, especially if your MP is a Liberal.
Now, some people may say, well, you guys are just saying this, CTV are just saying this, so what? Some random policy think tank is saying this. Well, it's a little different when the government's own parliamentary budget officer is actually saying it.
So I sketched out some of the numbers, but you've crunched all of them, and they don't quite add up. Why is that?
Well, it depends how you look at them. So the government made a promise to balance its operating budget, yet to be defined, granted, but it's also laid out a fiscal plan in its platform during the election campaign. But what we see here doesn't feel like it's perfectly aligned. For example, the government is indicated that it will reduce taxes, and it's already made the first steps towards that in the House. It's indicated that it will increase spending, notably on national defense, but also on other social programs, and at the same time, it has a fiscal track for the deficit. But what we see here is spending that continues to increase for operating expenditures in the main estimates that were tabled recently in the House. So all that doesn't seem to be perfectly aligned. So something's got to give up eventually.
And one of the things that Prime Minister Carney had said when he was campaigning was a cap in the public service. But in your estimation, does that get him there at all?
Well, these estimates are up to amounts. So based on what we saw in the estimates, the operating expenditures are slated to go up. And as I said before, the government could exercise restraints operationally by demanding that departments slow down on the rhythm and the pace of expenditure, but the documents for which the government is seeking parliamentary approval allows departments to spend more than last year. So that wouldn't be exercising restraint on the operating expenses.
So does Prime Minister Carney have to make cuts to the public service to get where he wants to go instead of just a cap on the public service?
Well, it's difficult to say for certainty because there were promises made during the campaign, but the real test comes in the implementation of these measures. So in the campaign, the government promised to increase national defense spending, for example, 30 billion over a number of years, but it could choose to take a slightly different path, which would allow the government to post deficits that are aligned with its election pledges without cutting the public service, but it would require reducing the speed at which it implements its program. So if the government really wants to implement its program as outlined in the campaign, it would need to, and respect its fiscal bottom line that it also indicated in the campaign, it would mean reducing the size of the public service rather than just capping its growth.
So when your own Liberal appointed budget officer tells you this isn't possible unless you do X, Y, and Z, you know it's going to be really bad.
Now, just to remind everybody, we heard from people that were on the ground in all of the Ottawa area ridings. And what was going on is you were having Liberal campaigners knocking on doors and saying to these people, if you vote for the Conservatives, you will lose your job as a public servant. And now we have a report that says, oh, you thought the cuts under the Stephen Harper era were bad? Well, he's going to look like Santa Claus as a result of this. 25%, that's 90,000 jobs, folks. 90,000. That's an entire riding.
That's an entire city. That's bigger than the city I grew up in, population-wise.
So, what are you going to do? And this is what Yves Giroux is saying. You either have to slow down, which means Carney's not going to be doing all of the things that he said he's going to do in the time that he says he's going to do it, which means that's a complete failure. Or he has to cut the workforce by 90,000. That's a massive amount. And he makes a good point. We're spending all this extra money on Department of Defense. So you're not going to be making cuts to there, which is basically one of your largest buckets of where you would actually look to reduce operating expense. He even says, well, you could tell the departments, don't be spending as much, don't be in buying as much technology, don't be buying as much furniture, Nope, apparently spending has gone up across the board.
Yeah, but I mean, even in government and any company, your payroll is your biggest expense typically.
100%. That's why when you need to reduce cost in a hurry, that's where companies go after it. Payroll is by far the biggest expense for literally any company. And for Carney to sit here and say, oh, we're going to use AI to find efficiencies in government. I'm sorry. I'm not sorry, actually. But I'm sorry. As someone that has worked in the tech sector for 20 years, and you as a prime minister, you're saying you're going to come in to government and say, well, we're just going to implement AI and it's going to find... You are using some of your own safe supply. That's what you're doing.
I wonder if he means that they're going to use AI to replace jobs instead of calling, say, the CRA and finding out when they're open. Then you just type into a computer and the AI spits it right out back at you.
Sure. And you know what? Fine. Say you're going to do that. You know how long that's going to take to implement in the government? Years. I mean years. Because you know why? That infrastructure isn't there. I know. I worked there. It doesn't exist. So for you to all of a sudden just say you're going to do that, no, this is not just something you slam in over a weekend. It's not going to happen. You need to start now if you want to say implement this in 3 or 4 or 5 years. Remember, the public service, the federal public service has around 367,000 people that work in it across the country. So, and you're not going to be asking these tiny little agencies to lay off people. You're going to be going after the bigger agencies because there's a bigger chunk of the pie. So You're saying, yeah, go ahead and spend more in technology and go ahead and spend more in your projects, but you know, you're going to have less to work with. The only other option here, folks, sorry, there's two other options, is he's going to raise taxes somewhere else and raise taxes massively.
You mean like a home equity tax, perhaps?
Could be. Or maybe it's an and. He's just going to spend with the deficit.
A bigger deficit than what we had under Trudeau.
Yeah, and the last one was estimated at over $60 billion under Freeland. And that's where she had her hissy fit and quit. So this is what that means. Now, this brings us to the crux of this. What's the impact? There was an opinion piece that was written in the Globe and Mail recently that talked about the fact that the NDP isn't dead and the NDP will rise again. Well, ladies and gentlemen, who does the NDP try to side with in almost all things?
Unions.
Unions. Especially
the Public Service Union.
The Public Service Union. So, what does this mean for them? Well, let's take a look at a few of the snippets from this opinion piece, and then we'll get back to this. Title: The NDP will rise again. Simple enough.
The New Democrats are almost as low can go. In 2011, they won 103 seats. They now have 7, their fewest in history. They've lost their official party status. They're broke. They have less and less working class horsepower. They have no Bernie Sanders. The 7 members that remain can't even get along. 3 of them raised Cain about not being adequately consulted on the selection of Don Davies as interim leader. Tom Mulcair, the former party leader and now a shrewd CTV commentator, doesn't mince his words. Quote, "It's a gong show," end quote. Some, though not Mr. Mulcair, think it could be game over for the party and that will move to a 2-party system like in the United States. Less choice, more polarization, diminished democracy. But don't bet on that. It's not about to happen. Just as it did after the 1993 election, where it was reduced to just 9 seats, the NDP will ascend from the depths once again. Before long, the New Democrats will be back to their usual level of support between 15 and 20%. They will be a force that Prime Minister Mark Carney, unless he can get enough floor crossers to form a majority government, will have to reckon with to stay in power. Given their dismal standing, the NDP will not be hesitant to force an early election. They have nowhere to go but up. Several considerations make a comeback for the party likely. Polls already indicate the recent election result was a fluke. The NDP is at 12% popularity in the latest Nanos poll, which is double their share of the vote in the election. So we would really encourage you to read this article. The link is in the description. It is an opinion piece, but this goes to what we were saying Monday and what we had heard from, let's say, party insiders who may not be authorized to speak to it publicly, but that the NDP is not just going to sit idly by and watch their own destruction. They are going to try to rebuild and at least gain party status.
Well, and this whole layoff, this isn't just hyperbole, it's not just speculation, because it's already happening. Check out this article that came out in May. Size of federal public service drops by 9,800 jobs. So that's not ancient history, folks. That's May 23rd of 2025. So it's already happening. So this bill of goods that the public service was sold, don't vote for the Conservatives. They're going to cut your jobs. Holy moly, are they in for a shock as to what's going on right now?
Well, unfortunately, it sounds like these folks got hoodwinked. And I don't say that with any joy or any I told you so, because again, these are people's jobs and it sounds like they were lied to. Well,
and they better remember what Mark Carney said and now what he's about to do, which is take away their livelihoods, just as the Liberals have been taking away the livelihoods of Canadians for the last 10 years now. So you have now the NDP that are, if they're smart, they're going to be jumping up and down, cuddling up to the Public Service Alliance of Canada and getting them on side, stealing away that Liberal vote because that's the only path for them. The only path. And as they say, there's nowhere to go for the NDP but up. So they have nothing to lose at this point, folks. So, they may take some risks, and they're going to try to continue to distance themselves from the Liberals as much as they can. And we've already seen examples of that. And we've already seen some good political maneuvering by them. Voting against them on the throne speech, voting against them on some of these other bills. So they better be raising hell over what's about to come. And this is why the NDP have been demanding a budget as well, because union people are losing their jobs as a result of this.
And don't forget, in this parliament, again, it's the NDP that hold the balance of power. So really, it's up to the NDP whether or not we go to election.
Right. Now, you have Mark Carney with all the spending. It's going to come to a head, folks. Something has to give. As the PBO officer said, something has to give. So you either have to cut spending, raise taxes, or both. But how do you do that when you've planned $130 billion of extra spending in your campaign? You want to almost double or triple the $33 billion in government spending on national defense. And you're saying you're going to cut overall spending and balance the operational budget. Anyone who's looked at any budget, anyone who's done math in their life, understands that that's not adding up.